Welcome to EVONA Origin Stories, the space podcast where we look to bring you extraordinary leaders from within the sector and their fascinating stories of early life, career, and how they broke into the space industry.
This is episode 4. I don't know where to start with our guest today. This guy has had an incredible life and career so far, and I get the feeling he's just getting started.
From being a mechanical engineer to a road racer, an entrepreneur, and founding multiple new space companies, one of which you may have heard of, a little old company called SpaceX.
He's now the founder and CEO of Phantom Space, a company that aims to be the Henry Ford of rockets in the launch business.
He's a great guy with incredible passion, energy, and a true titan of the commercial space sector.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jim Cantrell.
How are you doing? You okay?
I'm fine. How about you?
Yeah, I'm all good, thanks. I appreciate you're on a tight schedule. I want to be respectful of your time. So it'd be great to just kind of dive right into this, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I guess the starting point for me and Claire, it'd be great to kind of start back from the early days of Jim Cantrell, talk us through sort of where you started in life, where you grew up, school, college, that type of thing, and sort of eventually how you found your way into your early career.
Sure. Yeah, so I was born in the Los Angeles area in a small town called Yucaipa, which was known for nothing. And it was in the mountains about 50 miles east of there on the way to the ski resorts. And it was a small chicken ranch that I grew up on. My family was not wealthy. And to say they were blue class would be an understatement. And nobody in my family had ever had any education beyond high school. So I was always a curious child and tore a lot of machines apart to see how they were made. Was always interested in machines. That from the day I was born, I think I loved machines, and made a lot of go-karts as I got older. We lived on a hill. And we built these little wooden contraptions and stole the wheels off my dad's lawnmower and rode them down the hill to our near-death experience at the bottom of the hill, because we had to figure out how to stop as to not go into the road where the cars really were. So that it was a good place to grow up, frankly. And it was back in the 60s and 70s when no cell phones, and if you were to leave your home, you just had to tell your parents where you're going and promise to be back at a certain time. So there was a freedom then that kids don't have today. So I lived there until I was about 15, and ended up moving to Silicon Valley, where all the modern day venture capitalists are. That was back when it was really still building semiconductors, thus the name Silicon Valley. And I was there, went to high school there. And I was a racial minority on the side of town I lived on, which was the east side of San Jose. So I was one of 8 white people in the entire school. So I learned what it was like to be a minority. That was a different experience going from an all-white little small town to this. But it was a good growing experience. And that kind of prepared me for the day that my stepdad came home and announced we were moving to Utah. And I didn't know where Utah was, so I looked it up in the encyclopedia. This was before Google, so for those of you who don't know, encyclopedias were the early Google, and I was a prodigious reader of encyclopedias. So I looked it up, and come to find out there was a very large religious contingent. They called themselves Latter-day Saints. We called them Mormons, and I looked it up, and they were handcart pioneers. So I thought, oh, these are the guys that ride horse and buggies around. And so I'd seen a movie about them. I thought they were the Amish. And so when we arrived and it was a modern society, I was kind of surprised. But I went to school there, went to university there. I was surprised to have been accepted into engineering. Started off in electrical engineering, and I was very piss poor at it, almost flunked out. Then one day somebody said to me, you're a yearhead. Why don't you go to mechanical engineering? It's true. I raced cars, built cars. I was in fact working as a Ford mechanic, putting my way through college because I moved out of the house and my parents said, well, we're not paying for it anymore. And so went into mechanical engineering and did much better. And what happened in my third year of college was walking down the hallway, I came across a poster that was advertising a space systems engineering course that was funded by NASA that you had to apply for, and they were designing a Mars rover. And I had thought most of my, nearly adult life that I would probably go work for General Motors or Ford or Chrysler or something like that. But this sort of gave me another idea that, hey, we could go design a rover for Mars, which I thought was really cool. So I applied for the course, was accepted, and it was, I was way outclassed by everybody who was much older and much more further along in their studies than I. But I made up for it with a lot of tenacity and a lot of hard work. And at the end of that year, we went to Washington, D.C. and presented our Mars rover design to NASA, and we won. And as it turns out, the winner got a job with the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, and I ended up being one of the two selected to go do that. So I was triple shocked. So that's how I got into the space business, and the rest is kind of history.
So what was the next step from there then, Jim? After getting into the two that were selected, where did your career go from that point?
Yeah, so the project I got assigned to at JPL was a Mars balloon, and NASA had given some money to JPL to study this concept for a mission. And at the time, this was mid-'80s, after Challenger had blown up. Nothing was flying. Things were pretty dismal here in the space business. So I began to wonder why I was in it, right? And but we in the Mars balloon project were having a lot of fun because we were prototyping these and testing them. And one of the things that happened was the Planetary Society, also in Pasadena, California, was informally cooperating with the Soviet space program and also the French space program. And Lou Friedman, who was one of the founders of the Planetary Society, had come from JPL. Bruce Murray was a former director there, and then Carl Sagan, and he was one of the founders as well. So they would invite us to these meetings where the Soviets and the French would talk about their mission to Mars. At the time, it was called Mars 92. And they had planned to send a balloon and rovers and some penetrators to Mars with two separate satellites. And that was my first introduction to Soviets. I thought they were 13 feet tall and superhuman and all these sort of things. And my first one I met was Slava Lincoln, and he, the name I thought was funny, but he had a perpetual smile on his face and very professorly and anything but a superhuman 13-foot person, very, very kind man. But the long story made short is that we continue to work with them informally. And by the end of about 6 months, I had designed something called the Mars Snake, which was a special payload that could land on the surface of Mars under a balloon and not get stuck in the rocks. And it was basically a mechanical snake. And we patented it, and the French needed it. And so when I got close to graduation, they offered me a job. I refused. They offered me more money. I refused because I didn't want to move to France. And then they offered me so much money, it was ridiculous. So I accepted the offer. So I went over to France in about 1989 and was there for 3 years, leading the snake design for the French Space Agency. So I was officially part of this Soviet/French mission to Mars. So I didn't know a word of French. I had to learn it there. That was a interesting challenge. First day on the job, my boss says, "Today is the last day we speak English. It is bullshit, and we speak French." So that's how I learned. And so about 6-9 months into it, I was pretty good at French because I had to. And they were teaching Russian classes, to the team. So I asked to join that course. And so I started learning Russian as well, and not thinking of, where this would lead. The best advice I can give somebody is if you don't ever want to go back to the country, don't learn the language. But at any rate, the project went on until the the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was August 21st of 1991, when there was a coup d'etat by the hardliners against Gorbachev, and he was deposed, and Yeltsin came back to power. Turns out I was in country during all of that. Long story I won't go into, very amusing, but we could see the writing on the wall that the entire program was going to die, because no longer was anybody getting paid. In the communist system, everybody got paid by the government. And when the government collapsed, there was no payments to be made, and literally the Russian government was out of money. So I headed back to the U.S. in about May of 1992. I could not find a job because people considered me to be somewhat of a traitor, because I'd worked with the Soviets and the French, and all my applications to Lockheed Martin and Orbital Sciences and these kinds of places went into the trash. And I did meet a guy named Bob Zubrin, who later became the founder of the Mars Society and later played a big role with Elon and SpaceX. But he was a rogue thinker like me, outside of the box, working at Lockheed Martin, and tried to get me hired there, and managed to only get security suspicious of both of us. So I ended up going back to Utah State University, where I got my degree. My major professor, who was Frank Red, incidentally the same guy that taught the design class that I first signed up for, hired me back because he knew I wasn't a traitor. He's a retired Air Force colonel, and he was running a small space lab there with about 300 people. So he said, come on back. And so I moved back to Utah. Felt like I hadn't gone anywhere in life, ended up back at the start line again. And so within about a month, I was trying to very much hide my involvement with the Soviets and didn't talk about it. And this Frank Red shows up on my doorstep early in the summer with this guy that he had graduated from West Point, and knocking on the door. His name was Don, and he introduced him, and he said, he's from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he wants to talk to you about your time in the Soviet Union. And I'm thinking, oh great, I'm going to get arrested. And I had this dramatic vision of being drug out and in handcuffs and made the perp walk in front of everybody. But rather than that, Don says, hey, we need somebody like you, because we're worried about brain drain, and the US government has a program to put money into Russia, into the former Soviet Union, and stop these guys from going to North Korea and Iran and things like that. And would you help us? And I said, yeah, sure. So that started a long program that I participated in with the Russians for about 6 years, where we went over and we started programs with them. We bought things that were that were offered to us. We were kind of like guys that would go over with suitcases of money, and sit down with them for a week or two and be presented with interesting things. We eventually flew a couple satellites, and two of them ended up going out of Russian submarines. We converted, ICBMs to satellite launchers, and we launched a missile defense satellite, joint missile defense satellite with the Russians out of Kazakhstan. And I ended up getting arrested by the Russians at one point under house arrest for espionage, and that got worked out. But it was a traumatic experience, I will tell you, and kind of ended my interest in dealing with the Russians. So after that, I tried to stay away from it, but I kept getting these internet millionaires, billionaires, whatever you want to call them, who were interested in doing something in space, and they could afford Russian stuff, which was really cheap at the time. And so I took a number of them over there. I took the Gross brothers, who started Idea Lab, over there. There was a couple others that I won't name that paid me to give them the tour of Russia and so on. And this was late 90s, early 2000s. And then in 2001, out of the blue, this guy Elon Musk calls me. I'm on my way home from work, and I thought his name was Ian Musk, right? Your accents are clearly English. His was clearly strange, and I couldn't place it. I had a very good friend in France that was Australian. I knew it wasn't Australian. Turned out to be South African. But at any rate, I told him, hey, I'll call you back when I get home. I got home, called him back, and it was a fax machine. And I'm thinking, yeah, internet millionaire with a fax machine, sure. And so I didn't bother calling back again. 20 minutes later, the phone rings. He's madder than hell that I didn't call him back. And he's explaining to me how he wants to make humanity a multiplanetary species, and he'd made all this money on Zip2 and PayPal, and he wasn't going to die, drinking Mai Tais on a beach anywhere, and that he wanted to buy Russian rockets, and I was the guy that could help him to do this mission to Mars. So I said, okay. And, he asked me if I had an airport nearby, and I can see the regional airport right here. And he says, great. We've got a private aircraft. I'll fly in tomorrow morning. We can spend the day together. And I'm thinking, no, you're not. I've got kids in the house, and I don't know you. You could be a lunatic, And I, had by that time I had security clearances, and I had a lot of briefings on threats and things like that. And this guy was just a classic threat. And so I told him, I said, no, I'm busy Saturday, but I'll meet you at the Salt Lake City International Airport behind security on Sunday, because I have to fly out. And so he bid on that. And my thinking was he couldn't pack a gun, get it through security, and if there were problems, there was police there and so forth. So we met in a rigid conference room, and Bob Zubrin showed up, and he was the one who by then had started the Mars Society and had the initial contact from Elon. And Bob showed up at the meeting, and so I heard him out, and he wanted to do this Mice to Mars mission to show that humanity can make the journey. So I put together a team of people to, define this a little better. Elon began paying us all, and we decided which rockets would work that were in the Russian inventory. And we, in the process, convinced Elon not to do Mice to Mars, but to do a greenhouse. And some of my friends at that time had built the biosphere here in Tucson, which is a place where 8 people lived in total physical isolation in terms of air and exchange of water and all that sort of thing. It was literally a closed biosphere. Only sunlight got in and out. So they had designed a growth chamber for Mars, where a plant, basically a weed, could grow on Mars using the Martian carbon dioxide and simulate terraforming Mars. So we decided to do that, and I got some of my friends from JPL to help us design the Mars rover and so forth, and the lander, as it were. And we headed over to Moscow to buy rockets, and that's when we made 2 trips over there. And on the last trip, we got insulted by one of the companies. Their chief designer spit on our shoes and bid us farewell. And then the other company really didn't take Elon seriously. They didn't know I spoke Russian. I could listen to their eavesdropped on their conversations. Yeah. And they were calling him a little boy and all sorts of insulting things. So I had along with me Mike Griffin, who at the time was a friend, and he just gotten out of the CIA, but he was he later became NASA administrator and undersecretary of defense under Trump. But at the time, he was just my Griffin friend, and he was consulting with us. And so the 3 of us walked out of that last place. And it's interesting because, the whole entire Russian launch industry sealed their fate with that one set of meetings. And Elon had already decided to build the rocket himself and start SpaceX. He didn't let us know this until we were on the plane later that afternoon. It's always snowy in Moscow, and this was a snowy afternoon. So we headed out to Sheremetyevo and boarded the Delta flight back to New York. And when you get on an American plane in Moscow and you take off, you always feel like you're on sovereign territory again.
Yeah.
So it was time for a celebration. So Mike and I are drinking bourbon, as I remember, and Elon's up there working ahead of us. We're all in coach, and Mike is in the same row as me. And he elbows me, and he was raised by Army colonel, so he spoke very plainly. And he elbowed me and he said, "Hey, what do you think that idiot savant's doing up there?" And I said, Plan 9 to save the humanity or something. And Elon turns around and he goes, "No, guys, we could build this rocket ourselves." And Mike looked at me, I looked at him, we rolled our eyes. And Mike says, "Oh yeah, Elon, there's the whole graveyard of dead bodies you're going to have to walk over to get to that point. it's not like this is a new idea. And he says, oh, but I've got a spreadsheet. And I looked at him, I said, Mike, spreadsheet, that's never been done before. And so Elon got angry, sent his computer back, and we started looking at the spreadsheet. It was pretty good. And so the longer we looked at it, the more serious we took it. Finally, I said, Elon, where'd you get this stuff? And he goes, well, the team you assembled, they helped me a little bit. And you loaned me the books, and so I did some reading. He borrowed all my college textbooks on rocket propulsion and rocket systems and astrodynamics and all that. And so he boned up on that in his spare time and come up with a rocket design. It was not bad. And he'd been hanging around with some of these guys I brought together who, instead of doing something sensible like building a race car in their garage, they were building amateur rockets that were 30-foot long and going out in the desert and flying them and having them turn into smithereens when they would land. And Elon was so impressed by this that he decided, well, with their beer money and building rockets, imagine what you could do with real money. And he was right. That was how SpaceX was born. So on that plane, he says, we're going to start a company to build this rocket. And when we get home, I want to drop this entire Mars Oasis, this lander, and focus on the rocket. So that's how SpaceX started.
Unbelievable. What an incredible story. Thanks for sharing. That's amazing. I'm just mindful of the time. There's so much more we want to kind of go into and sort of unpack as we go on. It's such an incredible story. So thanks for sharing it. If you got a hard stop in 6 minutes.
I can probably show up late to this meeting, so we can go through about 10 after.
Okay. The next thing I wanted to touch on was kind of failures and achievements, really. I know that was sort of, I think you mentioned it right at the beginning around the sort of social media generation, if you will. People always kind of see the highlight reel of successes, achievements, and kind of like the end product. They never really see the work, the grind, the sacrifices leading up to that. So what would you consider sort of over your life career, your biggest failure, and what did you learn from that particular failure or failures?
Well, let me preface this by saying, my life has been one string of failures after another, but I've succeeded more than I failed. So that's sort of the formula that keeps you going. And like we say in racing, you haven't lost until you've given up. And absolutely true in business and in your career. So that's advice I can safely give to anybody, computer generation or not. My biggest failure probably was Vector, that I founded in 2016. And we founded it to start a launch company to build small vehicles. And it ended up I left in August of 2019 and ended up in bankruptcy after my co-founders took it over. And I don't really think that it needed to go in bankruptcy, but it was really a failure of choosing my founders poorly. And I think as a result, I became a bit autocratic in my decision making because I couldn't get my founders to agree. Things needed to be done. So I was the CEO. So I just said, this is the way it's going to be. And this created a lot of resentment among my co-founders who were not really doing their job anyhow. So as time went on, I had also bought one of the co-founders' businesses, and he had been pursuing this small rocket business. And as it turned out, I got sold what we would call in American slang a pig in a poke. So the technology was not nearly what I was sold to be. The propulsion was not ready. We were running a new fuel called propylene, which is a cousin to propane. And the first time we went out and this was after we bought the company. First time we went out and did a hot fire test, I noticed the flames were very light colored. And I asked him, is that typical for propylene? He said, no, we're firing on alcohol. We never fired it on propylene. So there was some lack of diligence that I probably should have done. So, in the hurry to get going, I think that was a major failure. I also, I think I made some business decisions I wouldn't make again that were right in the context of of the way I saw the world at that time. But I've grown since then and realized how nasty people can become and what they can accuse you of later. And you've really got to mind the potential optics of, and that's an overused word, by the way, but you really have to mind the way people can see. You have to think years ahead of what if this lands on the cover of New York Times or Space News or whatever. What does it look like? So good intentions do not get rewarded at all, particularly when things go badly. So that hurt. I managed to recover from it. I spent about 2 weeks in my pool after I resigned, just sort of licking my wounds. And then Mike D'Angelo came along, who's my co-founder at Phantom, and said, "Hey, let's do something." So he lit my match again. So we off we went.
Yeah. And I guess on the other side then, Jim, as you said, the successes have outweighed the failures. So what would you consider so far your greatest achievement career to date? And you just mentioned Phantom Space as well. So where do you want Phantom Space to be in the next 5 years?
Well, so you'll find my answer very strange, but Phantom Space is doing very well, and it may become my greatest achievement. It is not yet, because the story is still being written. We're about 2 years into it. We've raised somewhere around $45 million. We're in hot fire testing. We've got a pretty strong backlog of new business and so forth, and we're moving very quickly without really talking much about it. So we hope to be this phenomenon that arrives on the stage and people will say, who are these guys? Well, they're Phantom, of course. But I've had a number of startups. 11 I've been involved with, and 2 of the 11 have gone belly up. The rest of them have been very successful, and have had a couple of exits. But my greatest success to date actually was winning. Actually, wasn't winning, was surviving the 25 hours of Thunderhill with a car that we designed and built, and ran against Le Mans teams and NASCAR teams. And for the first time, we went out and did it. And it was a crew of people I put together. I was one of the drivers. There was 5 drivers that did this, and it was such a personal achievement that I still get warm, glowing feelings thinking about it, because it's real. It's when you survive a race like that, it's a challenge of strategy. It's a challenge of preparation. It tests your car building abilities, your driving abilities, your willingness to not give up because you want to. At 2 a.m, trust me, that's the last place you want to be, is in that damn car in the dark with people closing in on you at 100 miles an hour. We were the slowest car out there. We started in a field of like 103 cars, and we finished 45th. And we were 6th or 7th in class. And when we got done with that, it was this immense feeling of satisfaction that we had really, truly accomplished something. And it was at the end of about a year's worth of efforts. We started building the car a year beforehand, preparing for this. We went out to this local track and we practiced. We ran 24 hours in practice. We ran night practice. We did all those things, and it paid off. And I'm still immensely proud of that. It doesn't generate revenue, doesn't put any money in my pocket, but it sure puts a lot of joy in my heart.
Amazing. Fantastic. And what would you say, sort of over the years, whether it's been in life or career, is the best and the worst advice that you've received?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to think a little bit about the worst advice. But the best advice I've ever received is to just not give up and to just jump in and do something, right? And to not be timid about a new opportunity. And along sort of the same lines, some of the worst advice has been to double down on opportunities that I knew, or on situations that I knew were failing, right? And it's amazing how people will advise you based on their own sort of personal interests, self-interest. And the bad advice I've gotten usually is because it's been from investors mainly, by the way, who want to double down. They take these enormous risks, but they want to double down on success when you know that throttling back and as we call it, pivoting is the right answer. And so my advice is, when you get advice that doesn't reach your gut, and you have a sense of something different, don't cave in. Stick with your gut, because your gut instinct, your first one, is usually the right one. And I always told my kids, if you look around at, you're in a dilemma and you look around at all the solutions that you have or things you might be able to do, if you look at the hardest one to do, it's probably the right choice. Usually that's the case, and not everybody advises that. They often look for the quickest way out or the easiest way out.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely great advice. And for you then, Jim, you mentioned a few people earlier on in our conversation that has helped you and given you advice throughout your career. I mean, what would you say was the best resources that you identified and utilized over the years? So whether that be courses, programs, or mentors that have helped you the most?
So early in life, my best resource, frankly, was my ability to read and learn independently. I like to say that's the only thing you really learn at the university, is the ability to independently learn. And I think the rest of what you learn there is just BS, poppycock, whatever you want to call it, relatively worthless information. But as I've gotten older and I've gotten more into the business side of things and less into the technical side of things, the greatest resource I've found is really mentors. And, Dr. Frank Red was a huge mentor for me early. And he gave me advice on things I knew nothing about, about where to go with my career. And he believed more in me than I believed in myself. And that was really important when I was younger. And as I got older, I've had some great mentors. I think of Gil Moore, who ran Project Starshine, and I met early on. He kept as a mentor most of my life. And more recently, Dylan Taylor, who's a very big investor, and I think he's CEO of Voyager Space. In fact, he just went into space last weekend on that.
Yeah, saw that.
Yeah.
Blue. Yeah, he's been a tremendous asset to me personally, and I've gone to him, for ethical advice, financial advice, life advice. He's just been fantastic. So you can't underrate the value of a mentor and somebody that you trust, and you'll be lucky if you have a handful, right? I mean, I really only have a couple of people I trust at that level, and you got to cultivate these people. And when they come along, you grab them, and they don't come along all the time. And you stick with them, and you treat them much as you would your own children or your brothers or your sisters.
Yeah, no, absolutely incredible. I think really appreciate you going through that, Jim, and thanks for your time today. Appreciate you've got a tight schedule, need to get on. We just have one final question that we like to kind of close out our show with, which is, in terms of advice that you would give yourself to someone who's looking to get into the space sector, what would that be?
Well, if I were advising myself or anybody like me, I would say be patient. This is a frontier economy. It's just beginning. Don't succumb to the sense that you're late to the game. In a frontier economy, being first to market almost never means anything. Take your time and decide, where your strengths are. And really, I give this advice to a lot of people. Don't focus on the money. You got to focus on three things. And the first is, what are you passionate about? Because if you're not passionate, you just don't give a crap about it, and you won't do well. Number two is something you're naturally good at. Right? For example, my electrical engineering, I was horrible at it because it just wasn't intuitive to me. So you have to focus on that. And then the third thing is doing something that has some demand to it, that will have some economic value or other value that people want to pay for. And if you do those three things, the money really happens, and you'll make more money than you ever really can spend. But it's amazing how many people go into the business thinking, well, how can we make the most money possible? And that they never make it. They never make the money. And it's the guys who really don't care about the money that make it. It's a perverse irony of the way things work, but it's true.
Yeah, totally agree. I think motivated purely by the money is only going to get you so far, and the passion takes you further, right? So no, it sounds perfect advice. So yeah, look, Jim, thanks ever so much. Really appreciate your time. It's been an honour to have you as a guest on our podcast. So really appreciate it, and thank you so much for your time. It was amazing.
My pleasure. All right. Good luck with your podcast.
Excellent. Thanks, Jim. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.